The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. This is Carol Mahoney. Welcome to our webinar. Before we start the webinar, there are quite a few people on the call. We're expecting more to join in just the next few minutes. A little bit of housekeeping. You will notice that you are all on mute at the moment. This is so that we don't get any background noise on the call. If you have any questions, we do welcome questions. Please can you type your questions into the GoToWebinar control panel under questions. If you have a problem with that, please type them into the chat message and we will try to respond to these at the end of the call. I'd like to now hand over to Genevieve. Genevieve, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Today, we take the opportunity to share across industry, including EDM Council and ISITC. These organizations, whether you know it, drive collaboration by bringing together individuals across various constituents within financial services to find better ways for us to drive efficiencies across financial services. In this lens, what we've identified is touch point data. Would be to this and educate folks on the basic, in a world where there are rules, more as an industry, and how best we can use that data and how most effectively we can use that data. Data professionals use terms like semantics, Untitled, data models. For data experts, this is their common language. For the business, operation, and technical,
guys, I think we may have lost Jen.
Yes.
Apologies to the attendees. Jen, are you back? All right, hold on, folks, while we correct the technical difficulties here.
I do believe Jen's lost her audio.
All right, so let me while she's coming back, this is John Bottega from the EDM Council. Let me kind of jump in and assume Jen's seat here. The goal today is to talk about what we're calling navigating the data landscape, introduction to data fundamentals of the title. The goal here is that there's a lot of very interesting things going on in this data space. In a new lens. We've been looking at data represented in relational databases now for almost 50 years. There is, I'll call it emerging, but practical use into finance, into retail. The big firms like Google and Pandora and Amazon are using semantic representation of data to discover new insights and information, to discover relationships that they couldn't see clearly before. The goal today is to discuss these topics with myself and my colleagues on this call. Where do we see this evolving in the world of finance? What are the barriers we're facing with adoption of these new knowledge representations, and what's the move forward? How can firms take advantage of these new ways of representing data to better their risk management, to better their customer service and view of the customer and of the industry. So just quickly, by way of introduction, again, this is John Bottega. I'm the Executive Director at the EDM Council. My background has been in the role of a Chief Data Officer for over 8 years in public and private sector. I've seen this industry grow up in data from when no one knew what data management was to now it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. So hopefully we can provide some very interesting insights. I would like to turn over to Rich Robinson for an overview of your background. Rich, please.
I'm back as well, John.
Oh, hey, Jen.
Okay, well, Jen, I just saw your intro. We were just going to go around real quickly with the panelists and give a quick intro, and then you could pick it up from there if that would make sense.
Perfect.
Yeah, so Rich Robinson, over 25 years in the industry, so I'm sounding a little old now. Grew up in data world with alongside John as well. We were involved in a lot of the same efforts and whatnot over the years. So yeah, right now I'm at Bloomberg. I'm a board member for ISITC, and happy to be here. So.
Paul?
Hi, Carl Engler from ISDA. Obviously, working at ISDA, my primary focus is the derivatives world. So I have been involved for a long time in FPML, Financial Products Markup Language, which is kind of a messaging data standard for OTC derivatives.
Very good. And Carla McKenna, have you joined us?
Yes, John, I'm here.
Carla
McKenna? Sure, go ahead.
No, please introduce yourself.
So Carla McKenna, working for Citibank, representing today on this call the International Organization for Standardization, particularly the committee that develops and maintains standards for financial services. And we have in the area of 3 different kinds of standards: security for financial services, reference data for financial services, and models and messaging for financial services.
Jen, I guess that covers it. If your audio is working, we'll hand it back over to you.
Oh, I'm going to test it out. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So sorry about that. I have no idea what happened, so my apologies. So thanks again, John, for jumping in. As you've heard, we have an expert set of panelists that we brought together to really enlighten us on the basics around data and talk through the work that they're doing within their organizations to drive data success. Data rules our industry today. You always hear about the value. Data is gold. Data is the new oil. We need to look at how we effectively bring together our organizations to use that data and collaborate for success. Each one of the groups that we've handpicked to be represented on this panel has an expert niche in various areas where there's a touch point against data. So we wanted to bring together this group of folks to really highlight how data is connected, whether you're looking at it from the lens of more of a data semantic, thinking about ontologies and so on and so forth, or if you're looking at it from a specific product set within derivatives, if you're looking at it from a standards organization, or holistically from an operational efficiency. So for the goal of today's session, we're bringing everybody together with the intent of having the ability to explain how the data is connected, how these groups are interacting, talk about some of the hot topics that are out there in which there's opportunities for us as an industry to really broaden our horizons and bring together these groups to share those opportunities, seek out what are some of the barriers to success and those obstacles, and how do we eliminate them and look at better opportunities. Even look at how individually and collectively these groups are getting together to work on addressing the data challenge. And then ultimately, in the end, the goal is to put forth a plan of action for all of us to get together. So with that, I'm going to kind of transition over. I'd like to start with Rich to ask the question around, can you talk a little bit about some of the areas that you're focused on, and what are some of the barriers and challenges you're faced with today?
Sure, thanks. So Jen and John both mentioned semantics and ontologies. I mean, they're all the talk for the data world, but for many, they're kind of complex and to appreciate. So I ask, how do we better talk about these things? Financial services is a complex environment itself, and naturally we want to simplify that. And the primary tool we've relied on for the past 30 or so years is standards. But I think I've come to realize that pure simplification is kind of a fool's errand. You can't just standardize away the complexity. I mean, you can organize complexity a bit better, but you can't really simplify it, which ends up what we've been trying to do. In this way, you need standards, but they're just a small bit piece of the larger solution that's needed. This is where semantics and ontologies come in, because the issue at hand is language more so than just data, right? So the latest buzz phrase regulators and others are rallying around is the need for a common financial language. It's based on a very good paper in 2012 by Andrew Haldane. The attractive idea about it is that we all should use this common language and we can solve all these complex issues we're facing. Unfortunately, I posit that there can't be a common financial language. Saying that you can have one is ignoring a real layer of complexity in financial services. So this goes to what I'm working on. I've actually just finished up a paper looking at how we can better approach our problems through a focus on language and utilizing lessons from the applied linguistics field. So simply, in human language, we know we have multiple languages: Germanic, Latin, Mandarin, and so on. And then we have dialects within those languages, such as Queen's English versus American English and everything else. Tomorrow, we can't just introduce some new standardized human language and eliminate all human language issues of today of translation and understanding. And looking at language, each evolved due to cultural, geographic, and other kinds of barriers. There may be some shared words, but definitions and meaning differ across dialects and language based on context and use. So the domain of linguistics and the more practical approach of applied linguistics attempts to provide ways to navigate these issues. This is done not by standardizing or harmonizing, but by creating adapters and translations between languages based on context and usage. In the same way that human language evolved, I'm saying that financial languages have evolved as well. They're separated by culture of firm types, or function, or geographies based on asset type. There are some common points or words, but that doesn't mean we can just mush them all together in we can't mush together the world of equity and OTC derivatives into a single language. The same word can have multiple definitions, vastly different inferences based on context and usage, and based on the financial geography it actually comes from. So while a dictionary can give you directions or definitions, it can't give you the right definition to use for a specific context, process, or function without added help. This is where ontologies like FIBO come in, but we also need to remember that a single ontology only can really define one domain or geography, and then that works with other domain ontologies like an adapter to find commonalities and enable translation and understanding. So the first key is going to be to define and agree the different financial language geographies that exist, whether by asset type, firm type, functional processes, or otherwise. Then we can take data dictionaries like 2022 and overlay ontologies like FIBO to contextualize those language geographies one by one. Right now, we don't have the basic structures completed, akin to building a house of standards without nails or mortar. By taking a more linguistics approach, defining the financial language geographies and applying tools like FIBO and 2022, we may be able to get that stable foundation started. So I believe that we have a lot to learn from the linguistics world, and it's currently lacking in any of the current approaches. In the end, we can't have a single common financial language, and we need to work on defining all the languages that do exist and recognize them before we can create the right translation tools and get to that interoperability point. A lot of stuff's out there, we just haven't recognized it and brought it all together in the right way. So that's what I'm working on lately.
Thanks, Rich. John, would you like to kind of chime in on some of the work that's happening in EDM?
Sure. And just as a follow-up to what Rich is saying, Rich, I'm going to try to simplify a little bit what you said in terms of language and its context.
Thanks, John.
Take the word stop. By itself, stop doesn't mean much. The universal stop sign, people know what it is, but is it stop talking or stop driving? Or, you know, whatever other thing you might be doing. So the word and the definition, absence of its context, is what we're the challenges we face. And this is, I think, what Rich, you were alluding to, the importance of looking at meaning and context to the operation that's actually in, whether it's geographic or whether it's across a particular product type or et cetera. So that's the importance. And this is really what the semantic representation enables you to do, is look at definition in context. Jen, what the council has been working on, we've been actually working on it for almost 6 years now, is this development of, you know, what's really core to the financial industry. It's financial instruments, it's the counterparties that trade and do work with those financial instruments, and it's the transaction that actually occurs. Traditionally, we call that reference databases, or security masters, or pricing masters, or customer masters. Really, all that we've done is we've taken those important areas of information and we've instantiated them into a semantic platform, designed a meta model around that, and that's what 5.0 really is. The opportunities it presents is now to leverage this new way of looking at information data in a contextual format and being able to see relationships that heretofore you would have had to have developed and hard-coded in initially. So, you know, just briefly look at historically, we've represented data going back 60, 70 years ago on tape, and tape was sequential. You can almost say scalar. The introduction of looking at data in row and column, now commonly known as reference databases, is almost 50 years old, and it has run its course. It is in every environment we're in. Representing data in semantics, you can look at it as a third-dimensional representation. If anybody who has seen nodal graphs, you see how points of information are related to other points of information, and their meaning matters in a context of how they're related. So that's what this new semantic representation is. Really, really important in the sense that if you want to move to things like machine learning and AI, this is how the data has to be represented, because this enables insight. Now, you know, Jen, you asked earlier about barriers. Well, we've got 50 years of relational database infrastructure. We're not going to turn that battleship in a day. But the exciting thing is that more and more banks, financial firms, other firms are starting to experiment with this, and we're seeing an uptick in the interest and in the successful use cases applied.
John, thanks so much. Carl, handing it over to you to talk a little bit about the focus on ISDA as it relates to the work you're doing.
Thank you. The 3 areas of work I briefly would want to highlight. So the first one relates to reference data and the standardization of reference data. The second one is regulatory semantics and industry semantics and how they kind of work together and what the differences are. And the third area is the area of process standardization, and that's where the work on CDM, common domain model, comes in. So the first one, reference data and standardization of the reference data. Good reference data really is critical to achieve data quality. And if you look at regulatory reporting, a lot of the data quality issues can be brought back essentially to reference data problems. Defining good reference data starts with identifying the appropriate source for the reference data, where does the data originate, and who's best placed to keep that data up to date. If you look at generally the financial industry, certainly if you look at the derivatives industry, a lot of the trade processing infrastructure historically has developed around central utilities. And in a way, these central utilities police the reference data they accept and they work with, and through that policing, they kind of provide a level of standardization. However, when you move to a more decentralized environment, and obviously there's a lot of talk about blockchain technology and decentralization, you do not really have that central utility that does the policing. So the importance of reference data really is only increasing and is a big part of the data quality that we need to focus on. So the second area is regulatory semantics versus industry semantics and development of best practices. And this is where meaning and context come in. So if you take a term like partially collateralized, that means different things to different people. In the European context, on the EMIR, partially collateralized means that only variation margin is exchanged, but you only look at it from the perspective of the reporting party. So the reporting party might receive initial margin, they just cannot send initial margin. If you look at the CFTC interpretation, partially collateralized means that both parties will post only variation margin, but there's no initial margin exchange in either direction. So exactly the same term, but different interpretations, even in the regulatory context between different regulators. It's very important to understand these differences and to document these differences. They obviously have an impact on what the data represents, but also on how you process the data. Because in the European context, if you match on that field partially collateralized, you have to realize that you might get different results between the reporting party and the non-reporting party because each reports this from their perspective. Whereas in the US context, that field always should match, or you have kind of a disconnect. So a lot of work that we do is around mappings and try to clarify these differences. So an example is the mapping we have done between the CPMI, IOSCO, CDE, the critical data elements, and the data fields in FPML that are used for regulatory reporting, and try to understand where do they map, where do they not map. If there's not a one-to-one mapping, can we derive the values, and what's kind of the context around them. And we're doing a similar exercise with the data that's required for FRTB, the Fundamental Review of the Trading Book, which again is a regulatory environment, but looking at it more from a risk management perspective. And also here we find a lot of instances where data doesn't necessarily map 100%, and where it's important to understand how you go from certain data that's derived from a more trade processing and trading environment to data that's used for regulatory risk management purposes. The third area is process standardization and really rethinking of the existing post-trade processes. So if you look at the existing post-trade infrastructure and you would start from scratch, how would you develop that infrastructure? How can you improve the existing infrastructure? How can you, for example, reduce the number of reconciliations that are ongoing, which are very time consuming and cost a lot of money? And again, this is where blockchain comes in, and I look at it from a more decentralized perspective. If you look, for example, at a process such as regulatory reporting, can you come up with a system where you only have one representation of the trade, and both counterparties to the trade obviously have access to that representation if that's part of the confirmation process, but that same representation of the trade can be used for regulators to essentially see the data they need with regards to that transaction. So that's the work that's happening in the common domain model, the CDM project. Now, you talked about barriers and what are some of the challenges. Echoing what John was saying, there's obviously a lot of existing stuff out there, existing practices, existing applications, and changing that really is a very slow-moving process. So you really have to take the existing infrastructure into account.
Great, thank you. Carla, just handing it over to you to talk a little bit about the great work that's being done through ISO.
Thanks, Jen. So for many years, ISO standards have been used in financial services for stakeholders and players within the industry in order to be able to communicate with one another and execute on various transactions, report on transactions, and exchange other types of information. For the purpose of the webinar today, I'd like to focus on our ISO 20022 standard. The ISO 20022 standard was originally launched in 2004, and different than some other standards that we had launched in the past, like the ISO 15022 standard, we for the first time looked at the scope of the standard being able to cover financial services as an industry or a discipline, rather than just a particular domain, as 15022 covers securities. And like other of the panelists have mentioned before, the original focus was on harmonizing to a data model and a dictionary or a repository for ISO 20022 in order to bring together standards under the ISO 20022 framework, and try to be able to come to harmonized equivalent definitions under one standard. As has been said, the focus has changed over the years, and as has been said by the other panelists, the focus is now on interoperability. This is evidenced by the way that we have evolved the ISO 20022 standard in order to keep up with technological and business changes. The current work on ISO 20022 is actually focusing on semantics. To be able to give semantic capability to ISO 20022 and build on the building blocks that we already have with ISO 20022, which starts with a UML model of a particular business process that certain players and stakeholders want to participate in, establishing those concepts in the model, and then all the way down to being able to organize concepts in messaging, in financial messaging, so that messaging can be exchanged in order to be able to support a business process. The focus now is to take, I guess, a look at at a higher level of being able to look at the standards that have grown up either in different domains or for different purposes, and try to be able to at least relate the concepts in those standards on an equivalent term basis. And for this, the current group that is looking at the semantics work within ISO TC68, it has worked on a multi-standard semantic portal, and it's based on the ISO 20022 meta model that we already have, aligned with some new technical standards. One of them is RDF, the Resource Description Framework. Again, this also shows a continuing leveraging of other standards, where other standards have a particular niche or a particular command of a particular discipline, and this particular standard is from W3C. Also, using a technique which we've used in some of our standards before called SKOS, Simple Knowledge Organization System, and also OWL. In this, we have currently mapped the meta model of ISO 20022 into certain standards so far, two of them so far. One of them is the fixed protocol, which is the standard of the fixed trading community, I think, which most of us are aware of, has a particular discipline in the domain, starting with pre-trade into post-trade, which then connects to the business domains that are covered by ISO 20022, and also an adaptation of FIX called IMIX, which is extensively used in trading, pre-trade trade in China. The idea is to continue to leverage the multi-standard semantic portal to at least be able to understand where our standards can relate on an interoperability perspective with each other. We've also, within ISO, recently had discussions with John, particularly in the EDM Council, about how FIBO and ISO 20022 could be better leveraged to work together, with recognizing the fact that ISO 20022 has a meta model but is not an ontology in itself.
say, Jen, can I just jump in? Pull some points together. Carol's point about partially collateralized is a good one. I mean, that perfectly illustrates a dialect difference in language, and that's where applied linguistics has approaches for identifying those kind of different dialects and different interpretations that then can inform the necessary semantics and ontology stuff, as well as say, okay, well, these are the different definitions that you would put in 20 or 22, let's say, and then use an ontology on top of that, 5.0 or otherwise, to figure out which context you need depending on the dialect, and that would also aid in the translation between dialects, so you know when you have differences and what you need to add or subtract to do that interoperability bit. So that's just a good, that was a great example, Carl, so to bring that all together on how all these four things can all work together.
Thanks, Rich, appreciate you kind of chiming in. So as we've heard the various panelists kind of speak about some of the things that you're doing, obviously we're hearing a lot of consistent themes. We talk about semantics and ontologies, and that's really just how do you relate data and bring it together. But the one thing that it's definitely very clear with all of you represented on here is that, and I think Carla, you kind of indicated it, each area has a command discipline around certain areas, and I think each one of your existing industry organizations has distinct disciplines. So, and I think as we were prepping for this webinar, I think somebody had alluded to, no one organization does it best. Each one is a specialist. So how do we bring together the various work that's being done? And some of you alluded to some activities that are already underway. Where are there opportunities? I know that we're driving towards some opportunities, but it sounds like there could be more opportunities for the industry, especially the members of these industry organizations, to further collaborate for success. So I know, Carla, you just kind of finished, but I'd like to build off of some of the things that you spoke about earlier around those other opportunities, building off of whether it's on the fixed side or the 5.0 side, around seeing opportunities that you see out there.
Thanks, Jen. Yes, we've actually in the last several years have taken a long, hard look at the way that the financial services businesses and industry has changed, and we have actually reorganized our committee work within the last several years. We're focusing, as I said in my introduction, always on security of financial transactions, and that would and data, whether it's used in transactions or at rest. And of course, that's a particular focus this year with, of course, cybercrime and cyber security issues. But more to this panel and the topic of this webinar, we've taken out all of our reference data standards, which in effect are usually comprised of codes with reference data records that support the description of what the code means, and reorganize them into one subcommittee that's looking after reference data as a discipline. We see this being able to give us a better opportunity to canvass the key standards for reference data that we do need to support, and how we can make the standards more consistent across the same data elements being used within standards. For this, we'll also leverage our ISO 20022 repository and model by making sure that all of the concepts that are represented in our reference data standards actually are represented, cataloged, and modeled properly in our ISO 20022 repository and available for reuse by either ourselves in developing new standards or by other users in developing ISO 20022 to support their business processes.
Thanks, Carla.
Also, sorry, Jen, go ahead. I can come back to it later.
Okay, great, thanks. So just kind of jumping over, I'm going to switch up on my panelists because I like to do that. So just kind of jumping over to John, can you talk a little bit about some of the opportunities you alluded to earlier on with regards to, you know, partnership with these organizations and beyond the work that you're doing?
Sure. Kind of go leverage off of what Carl said in terms of the regulatory space as well. So this, you know, we're at a crossroad in the industry right now. We've got this emergence of analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence. One of the efforts, Jen, that the EDM Council is involved in right now is a collaborative group called the European Banking and Regulatory Data Forum, which is looking at ways to modernize regulatory reporting. This is something that I presented on at a couple of conferences, and it's really a global issue. It's just happened to be right now concentrated in the UK, but the US Treasury Department, the ECB, Bank of England, FCA are all talking about this. And basically what they're saying is we need to modernize reg reporting by changing the paradigm from a report-based paradigm to a data-based paradigm. Can we deliver data to the regulatory community versus all of these pre-constructed reports? Now, we can't eliminate every report. Obviously, there's some analytics, but there's a lot of data that if the regulators can get their hands on this granular level data, they could perform their own analytics. Everybody is in agreement that this is a move in the right direction. In fact, Oliver Burrows, who's the Chief Data Officer for Bank of England, pointed out that most of our regulatory reports today were designed before computers. So we're not leveraging the technologies we have. But at the bottom, the bottom line here is we need consistent data to make that happen. So that's one very, very interesting and an effort that's gaining momentum right now. Alongside of that, you've got the Financial Conduct Authority that is in an effort right now, a tech sprint where they're asking for input on the hypotheses that ontologies could represent regulatory rules and help them, enhance them in the regulatory's responsibility, fiduciary responsibility of safety and soundness. On top of that, you've got the CDO, which we're now referring to as the Chief Data Officer 2.0. They're being charged with bringing value to their firm using the data asset. And overarching all of this is ethics. Are we using our data ethically? Are we using it properly? If we don't have an agreement on what Rich said earlier, that the meaning of data, all of those things which are converging right now on this industry, and in fact, all industries, are not going to be possible without that data being harmonized, being organized, and being consistent. So I guess, Carl, to answer your question is, there are a lot of real business cases going on right now that are going to be contingent upon the things we've just talked about: consistent data, consistent meaning.
Rich, you want to kind of build upon that from the lens of is it seeing some of the things that you've highlighted?
Yeah, sure. So consistent data in a specific context, or what I'm calling a language geography, right, John? So consistent data is going to depend on where you're using it, right? To John's points and Carla's points, I mean, there's a lot going on. Even with I hear an echo a little bit. John, maybe you have to go mute. Okay, yep, that fixed it. Okay. So to John, your points, Carla's points, there's a lot going on. We're creating standards, agreements, and everything else, but at the end, it comes down to how they should be used. What are the best practices for using it, and bringing communities together to agree those best practices? That's really ISITC's sweet spot. Assembling all these seemingly diverse pieces, the different players, the different domains, different folks that have interest, and bring it together in a neutral forum that doesn't advocate anything else, but just getting stuff to work and work together. Assembling that together, fostering collaboration across different domains and the financial geographies, and identify what these different things are and how to get them to work together.
Rich, if I can add to that, and I think this specifically to Jen's point, We've recently done a study of initiatives that are in process along this topic line, along the topic of harmonizing data, improving reg reporting, improving transparency of information, improving ethical use of data. Nothing short of almost 24 efforts in process right now, acting kind of independently. That's a shame, because that's a lot of smart minds probably rediscovering stuff that each group is discovering. So one of the goals from a council perspective, because we view ourselves as a neutral trade association, is how can we bring a lot of these efforts together and really have a concentration of really smart people and smart approaches and critical mass to drive this. So one of the reasons why the EDM Council has been having deep discussions with ISITC is on this topic, with ISMA, with this European group, with these other initiatives happening in Central Europe and in the US. The goal here is let's bring all of these smart people together and really start to drive change in industry. Without it, we're going to be, a landscape of really smart cylindrical things, but not doing it across the landscape.
Totally agree. And I mean, that's what we do in financial services, recreate the wheel every couple of years, right? And to that point, there's stuff outside of the financial services discipline. That's why I say linguistics is solved for a lot of these problems on how to address different language, translation, and dialect issues, which will feed that semantics and ontology discussion. Yeah, and to your point, lots of different coordination going on. ISITC is doing the work with SIFMA and ISDA on T and T+1 OTC derivatives, and the cleared, non-cleared stuff and all that, and a number of other things. But bringing all those things together from Asia out to California, and bringing it all together across Europe and Africa as well. We need a way to coordinate this stuff better.
So what are some suggestions then? I mean, I think that's part of what we're trying to achieve here. And ultimate goal is, there's some great work being done, as you've alluded to. People are acting independently. We want to bring together a concentration of experts. Where do you see opportunities, and I open this up to any one of the panelists, for us to do this more effectively and use the assets, meaning the people, in the most effective way that we can? Because I can speak for myself, we're all getting hammered with responding to the variety of all the questions that are out there. And when you kind of read into it, there's a lot of similarities. So how can industry groups like yourselves look to maybe rationalize, bring it together, and as a collective provide insights and feedback and responses?
That's why I offered up a ISITC in that role, sort of looking at it from a full context. EDM's got that data expertise and has it across the industry and across the different asset types and the people. ISDA has the deep derivatives knowledge. ISO has the global community from a standardization basis. ISITC's always been focused on, so I'll go back to linguistics versus applied linguistics. Linguistics sort of like the deep study of language. Applied linguistics goes, what are the practical problems that we need to solve? That's what ISITC's always been focused on. So we need to identify what are the practical problems and then get everybody organized to solve that without distracting ISDA from CDM, which is a great thing, and derivatives focused stuff. EDM needs to solve the data problems and work with the chief data officers and get good data management practices in there. But there's some practical problems that we need to all be able to agree with, which will then set up a foundation for all those other organizations to actually implement what they need to implement in a consistent way globally.
Rich, I think it's important too that we identify the right stakeholders. And what we've experienced with standards and standards adoption is it's very difficult to introduce standards into the middle of the supply chain. So what I mean there is to introduce standards at the bank level when the regulators are not adopting the standard, or the providers of data, the exchanges and the market data consolidators are not adopting the standards. What's the incentive for the banks to adopt. They're not being pulled, they're not being pushed. So what's important here is who are the right stakeholders across that supply chain. Jen, I had a great opportunity a couple of weeks ago to present to the ANA board. They were in New York City for a meeting, representatives from all the global stock exchanges there, and the concept of adopting of standards to improve risk management and regulatory reporting resonated tremendously with the stock exchanges. And think about it. If we can have standards, all the things we talked about, Rich, the linguistic side and the contextual side, but starting with the exchanges, to the market data consolidators, to the banks, and to the regulators, now you've completed the chain. Now there's an incentive to do it because there's efficiencies across the entire chain. That's what we really need to do. Identify the right stakeholders so that the incentives are there. So when it comes down to it, none of this happens without investment. Will those institutions across that supply chain invest? And I think we're at that crossroad where this is now viable. The business case is real. The opportunity to save huge amounts of money through improved efficiency and leverage for the offensive side, machine learning, AI, and those opportunities.
Yeah, I totally going to agree with you. The regulators have to be at the table. Everybody needs to be there. But we have to be aware that this community is going to continue to grow, right? It's going to continue to evolve, morph, and everything else. So it has to be a structure that can accommodate that. It can't be closed. We need to make sure that there's a way to incorporate everybody into the discussion when it's needed and appropriate, but also keep it focused enough to solve the practical problem at hand. And then once that's solved, be able to expand out and continue to include more.
So based on what you've all highlighted, what are some practical, immediate things that we can start to do? We'll talk a little bit later on, a plan for action, but as I'm going through, and you talk a lot about the fact that we can't have a single common language, but we need to identify all the financial languages that are out there. Any suggestions on how we approach that best? I mean, we have a community of folks represented here. We have, your organizations have thousands and thousands of members that we can tap into. How do we do it best? Where do we start? I know it's a loaded question.
Well, I know EDM focuses on the Rosetta Stone for data, which is a great thing. I think that sort of is the sister to what I am writing about now, which is we need to get a inventory of all the financial language geographies and then break down into what are the dialects within those geographies. Then we can marry those things together with 2022, FIBO, CDM, but without having that base inventory and understanding where those communities lie and where there's some differences within the communities as language is defined. It's going to be more of a coming in at the middle and trying to solve up and down as opposed to laying the foundation first to build it up.
Hey, Jen, there's a question. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as the reference data is concerned, John, can you put yourself on mute? As far as the reference data is concerned, Carla talked previously about the ISO subcommittee that focuses on reference data. So I think that really is a great development, a great reorganization that they did at the ISO level. It is the logical place to do this, to look at this. So I think a lot of this work can be pushed forward under that ISO umbrella, looking at the reference data. I just want to add that also on the ISO side, I think it's important, and I think the success will depend on that there is a realization that not all reference data needs to be ISO data, and there needs to be an effort to just always try to find the right source, what's the best source for the reference data that we're looking at, whether that's ISO or something else. But I think it's a great place to bring this all together, at least as far as reference data is concerned.
Jim, there's a question from Jasper Brown. I think it fits very well into this discussion. He's asking if there are practical use cases. And I just want to allude to one that we experienced with one of our members who took their derivative processing mapped it to the derivative ontology, and instantiated that onto a semantic database. What that semantic platform provided was immediate insights into things like concentrations and risks. So we've in a number of cases have proven that this new technology, if you want to call it, can give banks better insights into risk, retail better insights into customer behavior, the regulators better insights into potential exposures and concentrations. It's now taking those successful POCs and bringing them to the forefront and matching it to everything that was just said, that Carl just said, and that Rich has said. End to end, the right people and the right motivation, if you will.
Thanks, John. You actually jumped into. I was right about to say, can we direct the response to the question? So appreciate that. I guess to others, are there other practical use cases that panelists can share? And this really kind of aligns to what are some of the drivers that drive your industry groups to what you're doing to be more efficient.
Jen, I've observed, especially since the financial crisis, a willingness for the regulators to engage with us as an industry in order to be able to see if the data that we use in order to be able to conduct our business can be defined once, can be reported in a way that we're not retooling every time that there's a new regulation. We've seen the best success of this after the financial crisis actually in the EU, where entire regulations, where a data collection standardized mechanism was defined, along with standard structuring of the data or cataloging of the data once it receives the regulator, so that analysis was easy and efficient. I think that we're going to see more of that going forward. I think that we're going to enter an era where technical difficulties or technical challenges, I think, will be less for us, and the focus will be on meaning and semantics and definitions. And hopefully, I've heard others speak about it, that other than concepts like the LEI, for example, the legal entity identifier, where you wouldn't want to define that more than once in order to have competing standards. That there is going to be much more of an appetite for defining at the semantic level and for different technical solutions possibly to be implemented, so that everybody's not retooling each time a new reporting requirement comes out.
Great, thank you. We did get another question with regards to interesting outcome. There's missing a further dimension around how meaning evolves over time and how ontology and definitions can drive that. Would one of the panelists like to speak a little bit towards how meaning will address, how this could be addressed?
Yeah, Jen, I was going to jump on that if you didn't bring it up. So, so thanks, Jeff, for that question. This is exactly where language, linguistics, and applied linguistics comes in, right? Linguistics understands meaning changes over time for various reasons, culturally, geographic separation, all these things that would have analogies in financial services by asset class, user type, firm type, and everything else. So there are structures within linguistics and applied linguistics to manage that meaning change over time. That influences how you add, subtract, or manage your dictionary, say 2022, and then that influences the semantics and ontology that you put on top of that. So that's why I'm saying that the missing bit in all the work that we've been doing is really this thing that's been out there for decades. I mean, since 6th century BC, actually. So when the first Sanskrit was interpreted, but Yeah, linguistics is there, and there's actually a common complaint that all these things that are in linguistics and people don't know about them, they try and solve them again.
Rich, the other thing to point out too is that exactly what you just said, RDF, the Resource Description Framework, and the representation of data in the OWL format, in the ontology format, that enables that progression of language and that modification of language. The difference between that and a relational database is a relational database tends to be cast in stone. And if language change or relationships change, you have to redesign your database. Now, over 50 years, people haven't redesigned their databases. They've just added adjunct pieces onto it, which make it more and more and more complex. With an ontology is designed to just click on different concepts and different ideas. It's representation of concept versus representation of the row column. So as you just pointed out, Rich, language evolves. This representation of knowledge enables you to evolve the language as well. So, you know, in the words of Gretzky, you know, don't go where the puck is, go to where the puck is going. We should be looking at designing our knowledge in this new representation, you know, 5 to 10 years, or else, you know, anybody who doesn't is going to disappear from the industry. They're not going to be able to survive.
So we're coming upon the hour. I took a lot of notes, and I'm trying to kind of get back to kind of an action plan going forward. You know, some of the takeaways that I'm highlighting, you know, from what all the panelists alluded to was context matters. There is no common language. We need to identify, what is it, the geography and the dialect, work towards that. We have to have and leverage our like organizations with the focus to drive towards semantics and meaning. We need to grow the community. We need to leverage standards. We need to identify those practical problems, ensure that the right stakeholders are engaged and that support is there, so we do things once and reuse wherever possible. So kind of, if I look at what we as an industry, some immediate takeaways, number one that Rich alluded to directly but indirectly is there is a financial roadmap that's out there. And one of the takeaways that we will look at is deciphering all the different languages that are out there today and look at the opportunities that can be shared more broadly. So I believe that's going to be one takeaway from this collaborative group together. I think the secondary was related to the regulatory activities that are underway, where there is opportunity for folks to contribute to these general calls for input in a much more efficient manner versus having to be picked on multiple cases. So with that, I do thank everybody for their participation. I found this nice fun quote that said, data is like people. If you interrogate it hard enough, it'll tell you whatever you want to hear. I think our goal is to get to data to a point that we can decipher its meaning. So thank you, and look forward to some future events from this group.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.